Hello, everyone. My name is Charlotte Ma, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this side event on reimagining business school education with responsible management and human rights. This side event is organized by the Global Business School Network for Human Rights in the framework of the UN Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum. During the next 90 minutes, we will discuss with our guest speakers how business schools are adapting their curricula to the realities of the labor market and the growing demand for responsible, sustainable, and purposeful leadership. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping remarks. Please be informed that the event is being recorded and the recording will be made available online afterwards. We would like to make this side event as participatory as possible. So if you wish to ask a question or react to what speakers or myself are saying, please write your question or comment in the dedicated area. I will be checking questions regularly, and we will try to dedicate some time at the end of the session to addressing some of them. During the event, you will see we will be referencing some recent news reports, some publications, case studies. We've put all the links to these resources on the webpage of the side event, which is hosted on the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum website. So today we gather to speak about business school education. Business schools play an important part in our societies as they create a bridge between the business sector on one side and young future talents on the other side. With a good set of skills and aptitudes, current business school students can actively participate in shaping a positive future for our economies and our societies. Now, in a time of change and economic uncertainty, it appears quite timely to have a closer look at how business schools are factoring global challenges and adapting their curricula to offer what we would call 21st century skills to, for sure, 21st century students. The speakers who join me today all have strong ties with business schools, either as teachers or as former students. Our experiences have occurred in the Asia Pacific region, in Europe, and in the United States, and span over a period of several decades, offering us a wide-ranging perspective on business schools and how they have changed and adapted over time. To begin, I would like to introduce you to today's panelists and ask them to help us understand what business school education looks like today, especially with regards to responsible management and human rights, and how that meets the needs of businesses around the world, but also the growing expectations of students. Dina Baswil, I'd like to start with you. You're the executive director of the Ramon V. Del Rosario Senior Center for Corporate Responsibility and a full professor at the Asian Institute of Management, joining us from Manila in the Philippines, where you deliver human capital management courses. Now, you have a quite important research work which you've published and presented internationally and which focuses around human resources strategy, workplace gender equality and diversity, woman empowerment, and also board governance. You are trained and engaged by international organizations, including the ILO, the OECD, and UN Women, and you are personally devoted to enabling that each organization can behave responsibly towards all of its stakeholders and, most importantly, to its employees. Can I ask you to share with us a little bit of your past experience as a teacher working on corporate responsibility, and if you have been witnessing some sort of change in growing interest of students for these issues?
So much for that, Charles. And yeah, I think at the Asian Institute of Management, since we have been in existence for the last 50 years, we have been very lucky being not just a traditional business school or offering MBA programs, but we also have a program for development management. And what that means is that in the classroom, we were able to actually have this perspectives, combining both the traditional perspective of MBA students and also more on the development side from our Masters of Development Management students. And really, it's different because you don't see those two perspectives, from the traditional MBA being more shareholder oriented, and then the development managers being more stakeholder oriented in the classroom. I didn't usually have that luxury of discussing it when I was teaching, say, in Mexico or New Zealand, or even when I was doing my MBA 25 years ago in the US. And of late, I find that the mainstreaming of these kinds of issues through the SDGs that was launched by the UN, students are becoming more aware of the expanded responsibilities that companies have beyond that of their shareholders. And I think living through a number of the aftermath of this lack of responsibility by companies, these students have become more interested in finding out how this can be changed. And I find the students who's are my students of late, who are coming from a more empowered, I would like to call it empowered, some people might call it entitled generation. They are more open to engaging in dialogue about how companies can be transformed towards becoming more responsible businesses. And at the same time, when the students exhibit this kind of interest, and I think we as professors need to be ready to pick up on this and have a discourse, and be able to keep these flames, or at least fan these flames of interest alive in the students until they are in positions within the company to be able to make this transition to become responsible businesses a reality. And I think that's precisely, hopefully, what we can also get out of this session, and how uh, we can make that change possible by reimagining what business schools can do.
For this introduction, and we'll get into more detail about some of the programs that you do, and also try to think out loud about how we can reimagine the education in business schools. Moving on, I'd like to introduce a second speaker, Rajiv Dubey, into the conversation. Rajiv, you are joining us from Mumbai in India, where you serve as the chairman of several companies of the Mahindra Group, Mahindra Insurance Brokers, Mahindra Steel Service Center, and Mahindra First Choice Wheels. But apart from your experience in the business sector, you're also a member of the governing body of the International Labour Organization and serve on the board of the International Organization of Employers, which is the voice of the employers, and where you are the chairperson of the Future of Work Policy Group. Uh, Now, prior to your experience in the business sector, you also studied in a business school in the Yale School of Management, where you actually still serve as a core member of the Council of Global Advisors. When you look back, both at your education but also your business experience, would you say that you were appropriately prepared to tackle some of the challenges that you faced in your company and that companies face today? I'll ask you to unmute yourself, please, Rajiv.
Sorry. Okay, so let me start by referring briefly to my experience at the Yale School of Management. Note that it was called the Yale School of Management and not the Yale Business School. And the degree that they gave at that time was called MPPM, not MBA, Master of Public and Private Management. So they were very clear that they were not teaching people how to maximize the bottom line of a private company. They were aware that there was an interconnectedness of things, that there was more than one stakeholder, and it was assumed that good people would move from the private to the not-for-profit to government and move back and forth. So in a sense, my 2 years at Yale certainly gave me a sense that all stakeholders needed to be addressed, and we were living in an interconnected world. So that's just a brief background. Let me talk. I've been very fortunate to have worked for more than 4 decades. First with the Tata Group, which also was led by purpose, and more significantly, the last 18 years with the Mahindra Group, which clearly took on the use of purpose and addressing the triple bottom line as the mother font for business strategy and behavior and culture and all human capital initiatives. So let me speak for a few minutes about my experience there. You see, it was about 2008. Now, we were founded in 1945, and they had already put purpose right at the center. I mean, I have all kinds of interesting quotations, but no time. But purpose was important. And the current chairman, Anand Mahindra, when he took over in 1997, actually reviewed the purpose statement, because to him it was clear that in the VUCA world, with pushback from all stakeholders, uh, purpose was the North Star. Purpose was the rainbow which we were going towards. And the question in 2008, when we started this movement called RISE, was, given the uncertainty, given the pushback, given the lack of trust, how do we unleash the potential of the organization, the people and the ecosystems, so that we can create sustained business outperformance? Now, it became very clear to us that if our strategy, structure, processes, and metrics were not imbued and completely aligned with extreme care for all stakeholders and rooted in the core values, we would not be able to create the passion, we would not be able to create the meaning that would unleash the potential of our employees and our ecosystems. So the last 10 years have been spent in trying to see how can we, in a practical sense, use purpose, use the fact that we are interconnected to create behavior that runs with purpose and unleashes the potential of people and ecosystems to create sustained business outperformance. Now, you'll have to tell me how many minutes I have left, because I will
No, go
tailor
ahead,
my...
Rajiv. Tell us a little bit about this experience, and because I know that it's interesting, especially in a time of COVID, when we could imagine that maybe purpose becomes a side issue. You know, we go back to the fundamental economics aspects of the company. If it's deeply rooted, let's hope it stays.
Yeah, in fact, just the opposite. In COVID times, purpose becomes center stage. Values become center stage, because that is where everything springs from. You know, the kind of decisions we take with respect to cash, for example. And I could go on and on, but let me just go back. So the purpose as we crafted it in 2008 was essentially to drive positive change in the lives of our stakeholders and communities to enable them to rise, and to do that by challenging conventional thinking and by innovatively using our resources, right? So innovation and empowerment were coming center stage, with the intention of unleashing potential to create sustained business outperformance to achieve our purpose of driving positive change. Now, we worked on this for 10 years. So first we created a framework that we call the 3+5 framework. So there were what we call the 3 RISE pillars. They were views of the world, attitudes. And we made sure that all the HR levers were aligned to these pillars. What were these 3 pillars? Number 1, accept no limits. Number 2, do alternative thinking. Number 3, above all, ensure you're driving positive change, right? So we actually worked on all the HR levers, the performance management system, the recruitment, the induction, the onboarding, the talent management, the reward and recognition, the communication system. And this was a mass movement. It was led by the chairman, Anand Mahindra, but he had a cohort of completely committed people like me and many others. And we knew that this was not the domain of the leaders or people sitting in air-conditioned rooms. It was a mass movement. And so we had to spend a lot of time connecting with the people, explaining to them what this purpose would mean in their daily lives, on the shop floor, in the marketplace, and why it would actually result in better business performance. So that link between purpose and business performance was absolutely critical. Now, I can't say we've got a 10 on 10, of course not. But let me quickly tell you what the 3+5 was, and then I'll stop. 3 were the 3 RISE pillars. These are views of the world that was seamlessly and automatically come into play whenever business decisions are taken. Accept no limits, Through alternative thinking, above all, ensure you're driving positive change. Then we identified 5 behaviors which, if lived, would bring those 3 pillars to life to create rise businesses that drive positive change and show sustained outperformance. What were these 5 behaviors? Number 1, use the whole mind in any situation, combining logic, intellect, and rationality with empathy, intuition, connection, whatever else you want to call it, the left and the right. Number 2, be a multiplier of what? Of energy, of passion, of engagement, by not being at the extreme command and control, by not being the leader wanting to show I have all the answers, I am the best, but listening to others, respecting others' views, focusing on asking the right questions, and then co-creating the answers. So this was the second one. The third one was knowing how to manage fear and leverage failure, because innovation was at the core of this movement. You cannot have innovation unless you take risk. Risk means at least 50% of the time there will be failure. Biggest obstacle to risk taking is fear. How do you overcome fear? And because by definition at least 50% of the time there will be failure, how can we use the learnings from failure to create success? So that was the third. The fourth one we call mindfulness. Mindfulness actually being open to all possibilities that exist and then consciously choosing which of these possibilities you want to create into a reality. It had to do with innovation, and you cannot be open to possibilities if you're a prisoner of your past. So it was a call to get away from being a prisoner of the past, in a sense, by being in the here and now. And last but not least, create trust. Trust through authenticity. Do I say what I think and do I do what I say? It is about walking the talk. It is about taking off the mask and having the courage to be who I am with my strengths and with my weaknesses. So we use this 3+5 framework to drive businesses that resulted in positive change in the lives of our stakeholders and communities. And clearly, because we were looking at all stakeholders, it was addressing the triple bottom line of profit, people, and planet simultaneously. Now, one can argue, and you referred to, I think, a case which we'll come to later on. Of course, there are problems, but it's been such an amazing passion creating journey for the last 10 or 12 years. It has made every day worthwhile. It has given meaning to us. It has made us also be connected. And we look at the role of business to solve problems, to solve the unmet needs of underserved customers in underpenetrated markets. With that, I stop, Charles. Sorry, I've spoken
Thank
too
you
much.
very Thank you very much, Rajiv. And we know that, I wouldn't say there is a crisis of purpose, but we know that students today are coming into higher education with strong demands about purpose. And I think it was really interesting. We listened to you as students explain a little bit this experience from within the company. And one of the questions we have is also how can we bring these concrete experiences from companies into the classroom, not necessarily to say that they're perfect, but at least to create discussion within students and faculty members about, how we can create new ways of management. Thanks a lot, Rajiv. Let's continue our journey. We'll now travel to Europe and join Dorothée Baumann-Pauli, who is calling in from Switzerland. Dorothée, you're a professor at the Geneva University School of Economics and Management, where you direct the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. Now, the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights is the first human rights center within a business school in Europe. Since 2013, you're also the research director at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights, which I believe was the first such business and human rights center in a business or a management school. You teach business and human rights, and you have co-edited the first textbook on business and human rights, published by Routledge just 5 years ago in 2016. Now, in the same year, in 2016, you co-founded a business school network to integrate human rights in business education. That network is called the Global Network of Business Schools for Human Rights, and it's precisely this network which is convening today's side event. Let me read you some of the headlines that I've picked up from news reports since the beginning of this year. In my home country, I'm French. At elite French universities, students demand environmental action. The New York Times. More recently, in the Financial Times, business schools urge to integrate ESG, environment, social, and governance topics, in core courses. Now, you are in close contact with students and their expectations. Tell us a little bit more about your experience with the University of Geneva working with students on responsible management and human rights.
With pleasure. Thank you, Charles. It's great to collaborate with you, and thanks for framing this session. I'm already really excited about what I heard from Rajiv and Dinah. I look forward to discussing reimagining business education with you and Emily, but also with the audience. The fact that reimagining business education is on the agenda of the Responsible Business Forum, I think attests to the role that business schools play. So I think that's a great start. The headlines, Charles, that you were reading to me, I think they suggest that we're at the beginning of a movement that is driven by the next generation, a next generation that demands to be taught the skills that they need to tackle 21st century challenges. And this certainly corresponds with my experience at the University of Geneva and at NYU Stern. So I've been teaching responsible management classes for over a decade, for the past 5 years, exclusively focused on business and human rights. And overall, I can say teaching has become easier. Most recently, tragically, with the COVID pandemic, it has further highlighted global inequalities and the need to also integrate the social dimensions of the sustainability agenda. And I'm thrilled to hear from Rajiv that that's also the case in the companies that he's involved in. It has further put an emphasis on the need of purpose and the need to figure out how to align profits and principles. So I teach at all levels. I teach at the undergraduate level, graduate level, and in executive programs. And one observation that I'm keen to share is that over time, I noticed that I spend significantly less time explaining to my students why human rights matter to business, and I spend more time now on discussing with them how to implement human rights in business operations. And to me, and that's particularly true for business students, that nowadays, I think our topic has reached a certain level of issue maturity. They want to roll up their sleeves and say, okay, we get it. How do we do it? Explain to us, how do we do it? And examples that Rajiv provided, are incredibly powerful and useful for students to see. Some companies are doing it. It won't kill the company. It's doable. It's not utopia. And here are ways for how to address human rights very practically. So the observation that students are more and more interested in these topics correspond to Dinah's. At the University of Geneva, I'm teaching since 2 years business human rights class in the bachelor's program. The administration assigned us a room for 30 students initially. Now we're online, but I'm currently teaching 140 students, and it's an elective. So they're not obligated to take this class, but they choose this. So again, I think it's another indication that this is something that the next generation wants to be taught on. And when I'm teaching them, I explain to them that they're privileged to be taught about human rights challenges in the safety of the classroom. Because today, I think business practitioners are still learning their lessons the hard way through trial and error, and they never had sort of a chance to discuss this in these issues in a safer context. I also tell them that the skills that I'm trying to teach them will be useful for their entire career, yet the specific human rights leadership skills might not be relevant in their first jobs. It might become relevant as they rise the career ladder in corporate hierarchies and maybe in their 7th job. These aspects, their decisions will impact human rights. And so essentially, teaching business human rights at business schools is about teaching leadership skills, and not only for people who want to work in a CSR department, but throughout all operations. And Rajiv also highlighted that to trickle down a vision needs to affect everyone in the company. So a person in the marketing department or in the sourcing department needs to understand what does a commitment to purpose or human rights actually mean for their day-to-day job. Overall, I would say that business human rights challenges are amongst the most complex and most difficult business challenges of our time. I've heard from many corporate executives that these are the issues that keep them up at night. I don't think from a research perspective, they are well explored yet. So at the Geneva Center and at NYU Stern Center for Business Human Rights, we conduct applied research where we look deeply into the business drivers of systemic human rights challenges, for example, in global supply chains. We then publish reports that are targeting a business audience and conclude with very clear recommendations for action. And it's those publicly facing reports and also public writing in the form of op-eds, for example, that we then want to bring back into teaching. So I am assigning some of my news pieces, op-eds to my students to ensure that we close the circle from research back into teaching so that they hear directly from sort of the latest insights on how to address human rights challenges in corporate practice.
Thanks a lot, Dorothée. When I look back at my education in a business school in France, I tend to remember an approach at the time which was a bit top-down. I think that what you're describing is much more participatory in the sense that it's true that on these specific issues, we might not have any affirmative, very strong statement to make to students rather than invite them in the discussion and help us understand how we can build systems and strategies which are more efficient. I find that very interesting. Let's stay in Switzerland and let me introduce our last speaker. Emily Sims, you are a senior specialist in the ILO program, which works on multinational enterprises and social policy. And you're the manager of a help desk for businesses, which is called the ILO Help Desk for Business, where you answer a lot of questions from the business sector. You have been involved in drafting the labor component of various key CSR instruments and have provided technical assistance to a range of industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives, as well as providing guidance to individual specific companies. Now, aside from your work at the ILO, you also have a foot in education because you're a faculty member of the Bocconi Business School Master in Green Management and CSR, which is currently ranked #1 in the world. Now, with that dual perspective, both as an ILO technical specialist, but also as a teacher, what is your take on how students are prepared to deal with some of the complex and I would say very concrete issues that modern companies have to tackle?
Okay, thank you, Charles. And it's been great listening to Rajiv and Dinah and Dorothea on their experiences that are so diverse, but there's a lot of overlap. And I think you'll hear from me echoes of what they've already said. But as Charles mentioned, I'm a little bit different. One of these is not like the others, and that is me. I'm actually a human rights lawyer and an economist. I don't have an MBA, and I happen to teach at Bocconi University in their master's in green management, but that's because of my work at the help desk. So what I actually, if you were to ask me what I am, I would say I'm a translator. I take these instruments that are written, multilateral binding treaties on states that ratify them, but that happen to be what companies are using as their guidance on what they should be doing in terms of responsible business as it concerns workers' rights. And I interpret for them what these things that are directed at states, what the principles are and what the implications are for company operations. So that's my job at the Help Desk for Business. And it's from there that all this other work with companies has come about. I teach at Bocconi University, and there my experience is kind of interesting because I used to teach what was an elective for about the first 4 years. And then it moved to a requirement. And as Charles mentioned, it's the Master's in Green Management and CSR. And the CSR part was sort of like a few odd students out for the first few years of my experience. But as more and more students actually became more interested in the CSR part and not necessarily less interested in the green management part, but either there was more of a balance in the student body, or a lot of them saw the linkages between environment and human rights and other social issues in company performance. They became more and more interested, and I migrated from an elective to becoming part of their core curriculum. And I was a little bit nervous at first, thinking, oh gosh, all these environmental motivated students are going to be rolling their eyes the whole time. But it turns out they were actually quite interested. And especially, I think the one thing that really helped is a wonderful video that shows the direct link between environmental degradation of the fish stock in Thailand and trafficking in human enforced labor. Very direct, very specific link that made them sit up and realize, oh, even if I am an environmental guy or gal, and that's my motivation for being here, I need to pay attention to these issues because everything is linked. There is no separation between environmental and human rights and other social issues. So that's helped a lot. And so I can say also I've seen an increase in demand, especially I teach at Bocconi. I'm a member of their faculty, but I also teach at sessions, like a 2 or 3 hour session for business schools in Europe and Japan, both business and law faculty with an emphasis on business issues. And those, I think, are really driven by a couple of factors. One is trade agreements. Any contemporary, in the last 10 years, trade agreement involving Canada, the US, the EU, or even other countries, for instance, a BIT between Morocco and Nigeria, they're all talking about labor issues as part of their trade agreement, in particular the fundamental principles and rights at work. And they're referred to not only as a government obligation, a regulatory obligation, but also a government obligation to promote business compliance with those regulations. But it also shows up in CSR clauses in these same trade agreements that are speaking directly to enterprises, because these are trade and investment agreements. And so businesses are paying attention to them because it may affect their standing in international dispute settlements, to be able to bring a claim against the government if they haven't lived up to their obligations in these same investment agreements. So that, I think, is putting these issues on the map unlike never before. But there's also the issue of national action plans on business and human rights. And a lot of them are paying attention to curriculum changes in business education as part of their broader strategy to promote responsible business concerning specifically human rights as a government obligation. But there's also the ILO's own instruments. Our MNE declaration was updated in 2017 to incorporate the concept of due diligence, which I need to point out is different than general human rights due diligence. And it's really imperative that anyone teaching due diligence as it relates to labor issues has to really go and look at paragraph 10. It's really important. The 2014 protocol to Convention 29 on forced labor that also references the responsibility of business to undertake due diligence. So these elements are also likely driving an increase in requests to ILO. Just as a last observation for this question, I'd like to share with you my biggest challenges in teaching in a specialized program at university compared to my normal teaching. My day job is not to teach in business schools, it's to actually teach companies one-on-one in discussions in the help desk, but we also have our own course on international labor standards and due diligence at our International Training Center in Turin. So the difference I see and the challenges in terms of an academic setting versus people who are practitioners who take a week out to attend a course. I guess the difference between your executive business education and your standard undergraduate and graduate programs. For me, the Bocconi course is a specialized course. It is a degree in green management and CSR, and there is no prerequisite for an MBA. So it has really, really motivated students, which is a great thing. But the students rarely have business management experience, and that can be a real impediment. And so a lot of my time is spent teaching them the nuts and bolts of how a supply chain actually works. Not works as a human rights issue, but just how it works, in particular logistics, placement of orders, etc., and how it operates efficiently or inefficiently, and how you need to understand that if you're going to address human rights violations in it. But also key production processes, because the big issue over and over and over again is who pays for this? How are we going to cover the costs? And the main driver of that is productivity improvements. So if you, as a human rights advocate in a business, have no idea about lean production or other productivity improvement methods, you're going to hit a wall really quickly and not be very effective in advocating in your business. So I need to spend time with them on basic concepts like, but you can't explain lean production in 5 minutes. So these are challenges for me. But nor is it, the other issue is that they don't have much knowledge on how supply chain management fits into overall business strategy for companies. Why companies are globalizing their supply chain production, how in a post-COVID world, or COVID and post-COVID world, maybe there'll be a lot more consolidation and reintegration, vertical reintegration of supply chains, and how to understand those dynamics, anticipate them, and use them in their advocacy work within the organization. So walking them through things like root cause analysis for effective remediation, it can be a challenge. But even more so, getting them to understand the complexities of power dynamics. You cannot address human rights in business if you are not addressing power dynamics. And that means between suppliers and their workers, but also between buyers and suppliers. One whole day of my 3 days is devoted to buyer behavior and how that puts pressure on chains, and how mismanagement of chains is a problem that the buyer needs to address of itself, not put off on the shoulders of the suppliers. But if you don't understand that and how power dynamics work in a supply chain, then again, they will not be effective advocates. So overall, my experience in business school, and again, it's a specialized program, but my experience is it's a great experience. And I use, my materials are squarely built on my 2,000 plus conversations with businesses that I've had. So the questions that illustrate issues, they're really rooted in the real world. And I feed those back and my conversations with the students back into my reflections on how to have dialogues with companies going forward as I manage the help desk. So for me, it's been a great synergy and a great experience. But as you can see, I'm very passionate about these issues and sometimes very frustrated because of the silos of I do business and human rights, or I do business, but often they don't understand how they go together. And if you don't understand that, it's a waste of time and an extremely large waste of resources. Right now, my view of CSR is a huge amount of skepticism that it is actually draining suppliers who desperately need resources, of critical resources that they could be putting towards higher wages, towards better conditions of work, towards upgrading their management systems to improve productivity. But instead, they have to pay for audits and other stuff. We really need, it's not just a matter of teaching, but rethinking business and human rights to make it more responsive to everyone's needs. Sorry to be so
Absolutely. No, yeah, it's great to have you in the room with us. And I mean, I'm happy that you're not providing simple answers to these issues. I mean, I think the worst thing for this side event would be to say, you wanna do business and human rights in a business school, very simple. Here is the guide, and that's what you have to do. Actually, it's much more complex than that. And Emily, thanks so much for sharing your experience on this, because it's true that I mean, the silos you are talking about, if I refer back to my education, I spent quite some time in business school as a student, is really, I tend to think it was also a little bit a silo. You know, we would have this class and then we would move on to another class, but kind of difficult to grasp both how all of these issues connect, and also, as you're saying, uh, kind of difficult for us to represent ourselves what the reality of the world of work is. And when you're talking about power dynamics, for example, these are topics that are not always easy to introduce in the classroom. And you know, what are the resources that are available for us to talk about power dynamics? Sometimes some of which can be, you know, sensitive issues. But let's move on in the discussion. What I keep from this first round discussion is that there clearly is some sort of a changing pattern in the way we introduce these topics to students. I mean, uh, you were saying, Emily, you moved from being an elective to the core curriculum. So this is really showing us, I believe, the trend. Uh, uh, Dorothée, you started with 30 students. Now you have 140. Um, Zoom must be very practical right now. I don't know how you're going to fit them. You know, what is it next year? 280 students? Where are you going to put them to be able to do the class with them? So also creates a lot of new questions in terms of how we're going to be able to deal with all these issues. But let's go back to our discussion. I'd like to focus on some of the concrete initiatives that all of you are doing. In a second, we'll talk with Rajiv about a case study he's been working on. But first, I'd like to go back to Dinah. You've been working with a concrete ILO project. It's called the Responsible Supply Chains in Asia project. And surprisingly or not, this project has a whole component which look at business schools. Now, you've been doing activities to train managers and students on CSR issues. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Absolutely, Charles. I've been very fortunate to actually be engaged with this joint project by OECD and ILO on responsible supply chains in Asia, and primarily around training future business leaders about international labor standards. And that's precisely how Emily and I met. I'm one of the students in that training that she was talking about, where we go 1 week in tour and talk about international labor standards. And I don't know if Emily remembers this, but there was one exercise where they group us into our areas of expertise. And unfortunately, I was the only academic in the room. And I was like, I hope that there would be more of us who would be bringing these kinds of tools in the classroom. And fortunately, ILO had given me the platform to bring it to future business leaders. So I spent 1 whole day, although it took Emily and her colleagues about a week to teach us all of it. So I just kind of like, try to pick up those important pieces that I feel they're able to really use already within their context. Because like Dorothy said, I mean, a lot of this standards, when they don't experience it in the near future, it doesn't really stick to them as much. And so the kind of things around, decent working conditions, minimum wages, discrimination when you get promoted, a lot of these things that they tend to experience within the workplace. Those are the things that we do tend to focus on. And we have gotten a lot of positive responses. I actually teach this session as a complement to my human capital management course in the MBA, and it's more of a deep dive into this international labor standards, which becomes more useful if the students want to work for multinational companies. What can they expect in terms of the working conditions there, or if they want to hire, international talent, because these are the kind of standards that these talents are expecting out of companies. Or if you're a company and wanted to export your products or services, and what are the expectations of buyers around your practices as in terms of managing your labor. So those are things that we discuss. But the unfortunate thing is there's a trend in the business school curriculums to actually cut back more on the hours, right? I mean, we've had like our program from 16 months cut to 12 months. And so I'm really finding it hard to find ways to actually still bring these kinds of topics in, and at the same time, meet the demands of my program managers telling me, Dinah, you can't like have more sessions, right? And so I find ways, I find ways to just kind of, okay, when I talk about compensation, I need to bring in gender pay gap, so those kinds of things are really enriching the discussion, but it has to be very deliberate because I'm not given any more time, and I feel Emily's dilemma about how do I teach them the basics at the same time, make them understand about these other things that are not as basic, right? Because you have to still have to do the foundations. Otherwise, all this knowledge is not going to be on solid ground, and they may not necessarily be able to use them in the right way. So those are things that we encounter. But I mean, after like this 1 day workshop that we do, or two if it's with companies, we actually get more companies to ask us, to actually do this with their people, and so unfortunately with COVID it has been very tough because what was mentioned, sometimes they try to devote their time in trying to get a handle of this pandemic, but we've seen more and more companies come and approach us and say, we'd love to be able for you to do this, and so that's very encouraging. And without ILO's support through this Responsible Supply Chains in Asia project, I don't think we'd be able to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, very interesting to see also how the linkages between an organization like the ILO and a business school can create these type of new opportunities. By the way, we've referenced on the website of the side event links to the Responsible Supply Chains in Asia project, and specifically to the activity that you organized at the Asian Institute of Management. For those interested, you can have access to some more information about that. I'd like to stick to this dilemma a little bit and also understand a little bit how it works concretely. Dorothée, I think last week, if I'm correct, was your last class of the Business and Human Rights semester. Last Thursday, we had the opportunity to work together on a session in April. I came with an ILO technical specialist to talk about fair recruitment of migrant workers, for example, to your students. Can you just quickly tell us what one semester of business and human rights course looks like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charles. I greatly benefited from you and Maria Galotti, ILO specialist for fair recruitment, to tease out the business lens on this buzzword theme of modern slavery. So that was fantastic. And it's certainly core to my teaching to make those topics real for students. And ILO material, including video clips, helped to make it real. After all, we're still all on Zoom. So the more they're exposed to actual practitioners and experts, and the more immersed we can make them in decision-making scenarios, I think the better for the teaching. But how does a semester look like? So I teach my class based on 3 pillars, and these are not the 3 pillars of the UN guiding principles. I think this is what many instructors do. They build their class around protect, respect, and remedy. I'm actually teaching my class around the 3 core skills that I want to teach students, namely identify, analyze, and resolve business human rights challenges. So I want to capacitate students to identify, analyze, and resolve these challenges. And of course, the UN guiding principles come in, but they're sort of infused throughout rather than the structural principle. And in this first part, we were talking about what are human rights, what's the role of business with human rights. In the second part, I'm then exposing my students to very different human rights challenges in different industry contexts. So we're talking about human rights challenges in the garment supply chain, which are radically different to human rights challenges in the tech sector, more focused on freedom of expression and privacy issues. And so understanding what human rights means in different industries, I think, is important to them. And then in the last part, I'm giving them sort of a number of tools for how to resolve these challenges, including discussing emerging mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, but also complementary standards that have been developed in multi-stakeholder initiatives, for example, and ILO instruments, etc., guidelines, tools, something that allows them to address how to do it once they're in practice. And for the students, I think it's important to realize that this is not a niche topic, but this is how successful business in the future looks like. So I want to come back to something that Dina said, and many instructors of business human rights are struggling with. Often it's not possible to add a business human rights class to an already very congested business school curriculum. But instead, we're suggesting to infuse this dimension throughout the core courses of a management education. So it's still fine to have an elective on business human rights for the group of students that are really interested in, but there must be a red thread throughout the entire program where these themes keep coming up. They should come up in operations management. They should come up in supply chain management. They should come up in accounting. I have a number of colleagues that really tease out the human rights element in the accounting discipline. And so as we can help our colleagues at business school to understand how to bring in these themes in those core classes, not even necessarily with an additional module, but in the case studies that they teach on a routine basis, it just has to become one additional lens that business needs to recognize as relevant for their business success.
Thank you, Dot. For
Yes.
sharing this. And by the way, when you're saying we, I mean what I understand also behind that is also the work you've been doing within the network, the Global Business School Network for Human Rights. I mean, trying to, I assume that teachers working on these issues sometimes can feel a little bit isolated. They can feel isolated within their universities. Someone earlier was talking about silos, and I think that can sometimes be true also to how business schools work. And at the same time, it's become so easy to connect with one another that you've participated in what I think is a great initiative, trying to build this network of practitioners. Not necessarily to tell people how they should do, but at least to try and map out what is possible, what is being done, what resources are available. And you've come up with a very interesting toolkit. We'll get back to that in the next part of the discussion. And I just wanted to mention to the audience that this toolkit, which is called The Case for Human Rights in Business Education, is a must read and is online on the webpage of the event. Moving on, I'd like to go back to Emily, our ILO Help Desk for Business specialist. From your experience working alongside the business sector on these issues, and you've told us a little bit about the concrete challenges. How do you think the ILO can participate in the effort that we're looking at to bring business and human rights issues into the classroom more effectively?
Yeah. Very good question. ILO, I should clarify, we're very committed to supporting training of future managers, but we don't have the resources or the mandate to really do that systematically. And the CONI is a bit of an exception. which I'll explain in a moment. Part of that is because our main commitment is to support our tripartite constituents, governments, and employers and workers organization. And that is our focus that we cannot lose. But at the same time, we realize current and future business leaders are really vital for actually achieving the objective of the ILO, which is the promotion of decent work and inclusive economic growth. But it's also a matter of us not being the best positioned. None of us run a company. There are some that have MBAs and have a lot of experience working in companies, but they're few and far between because that's not really what we do. We're focused at the macro level, not the micro level. Even though I myself am located in the enterprise department, we're a mixed bag of MBAs, but also development economists, a few like me, human rights lawyers, because we're coming at this from a more inclusive perspective that's focused not just on business and human rights, but broader enterprise development in a macroeconomic policy environment that will allow that to flourish. So we focus on our technical expertise and our convening power, but we are still there and committed to support building future generations of responsible business leaders without competing with universities at all. So it's in the context of development cooperation where we work the most with institutions such as Dinah's institution, the Asian Institute of Management. But we also work with government training institutions, in particular entrepreneurship development centers and productivity organizations. I spent 5 years as a researcher before I even touched the subject of CSR, just working with the Asia Productivity Organization. And it was a wonderful experience learning in great detail what is productivity improvement. And I use that extensively now in my training. So we work with a variety of institutions, not just universities. But my teaching at Bocconi is a very particular, it's an actual formal partnership between the university and the ILO. And as part of that partnership, each year Bocconi sponsors a business school professor who participates in my lectures so they can incorporate the materials into their school curriculum. And the students in turn can also hear about labor issues that are particularly salient in that guest professor's country. As well, we help facilitate linkages between the guest professor and various faculty of Bocconi who are working in the same field to build a broader institution relationship. So it's kind of contextualized in a broader partnership. And we actually report every year to the ILO's governing body on this partnership. So far, we've had professors from Colombia, Argentina, Uganda, Vietnam, Thailand, and Hungary. And our own constituents are involved. Like, for instance, in Uganda, it is a business school professor who works very closely with the Ugandan, the Federation of Employers of Uganda. So, there are linkages there. And as part of my course, the students are hearing from ILO constituents. Every year, I have a guest speaker from a government institution, whether it is a national institution, like this year it was the Minister of Justice of Peru, who was talking about his role in developing stakeholder dialogue around developing their National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. It's been the European Commission, the DG Trade of the European Commission has spoken to the students. So they always get a government perspective, they always get an employer perspective, they always get a worker perspective, as well as a guest speaker from an actual company. So part of my role is promoting the ILO as a whole so they understand our constituent perspective, and then applying that and then conveying back to the governing body and other government or other ILO institutions, lessons learned from having worked with business schools. So I'm sort of a bridge, if you will, between the ILO and business schools. Yeah, so that's a really important part. But just to highlight to you the training materials, because we do have materials that are available for business school professors. anyone is welcome to use my training materials. The only caveat is there are no notes because they're my materials, so I don't need notes. And anyone who's ever tried to write out notes for their slides for someone else to use, it's a very labor-intensive process. But I don't know if Dinah was involved in a package we developed in the Responsible Supply Chains in Asia project. It's funded by the EU, but that is a package for business school professors and others training SMEs on labor issues in responsible business conduct that has a special focus on due diligence. And the purpose is to help SMEs to meet their expectations of buyers, but also to help them understand when buyers are getting it wrong, because buyers don't always get it right, and it causes a lot of confusion and grief for suppliers or actors in the supply chain. So that is available, and that is an actual package with lots of notes and exercises that are, so a trainer could pick that up and use it, and it's a public good. So everything the ILO does is public goods that are available to anyone. So we have other tools also that could be of interest. They're all done in development cooperation contexts or partnerships. Like, for instance, we have a partnership with Tokyo 2020's Olympic Committee. And so in those various projects and partnerships, we develop short good practice notes on various labor issues, in particular around forced labor, trafficking, child labor, safety and health, that can provide examples. And they're from around the world, in particular developing countries. We realize that there are tons and tons of resources out there for what Apple and I don't know, pick a company, are doing that are companies that you'll find in the Financial Times. But small companies, there are a lot less case studies about good practices about what first-tier suppliers that employ 200-300 workers are doing that make it really feasible for others in that bracket to be able to be inspired by. So that's where our strength is, because they come out of technical cooperation projects. We have a lot of good practice notes from the supplier end, which buyers actually can use in engaging in conversation with suppliers to help them imagine what they could do concretely and how they can live to tell the tale. They can survive. I think it was Dorothea was explaining that you can do these things and still be a company that's going to be there in 10 years and maybe even stronger for it. So those are the kind of tools we have, but we're not set up for business schools, so there's no business school entry point on our website or whatever, but we're happy to share all those resources with the global network or anyone else, and you can use them as you wish. As I said, they're all public goods, so more than welcome.
Thank you, Emily. And it's true, as you were saying, most of this work comes out of technical cooperation. We see that the linkages often happen during the technical cooperation project, but it's good to know that these resources at the end are available for whoever is interested. And just also to mention, I think your point about how you've been bringing people into the classroom at Bocconi from outside. I think one of the fascinating things we've seen trying to cope with COVID and education is how easy it is for us to connect. And I think it would be really interesting, maybe in another event, to look at how technology can also participate in helping educators introduce these topics, because it's true that sometimes these issues feel like they're very far away. And also connecting students with one another. That's also part of the silos that we have. Once we enter into the labor market, we're going to cooperate with people all around the globe, and we're studying often with many people that are just like us. I would say this has changed over time a little bit, but it's something that we could encourage much more. Now back to some concrete tools to help teachers. Rajiv, the Mahindra, the company where you spent such an important part of your career. As you've said, and you've talked to us about the 3+5 equals success. Mahindra is very engaged on this question of purpose. Now, recently, you have worked with the Harvard Business School in drafting a case study on this experience. We've put it on the website of the event as well. Can you tell us a bit more about this work, this case study? Why should students read the Mahindra case study?
Yeah, well, I think that first Harvard itself is doing a lot of work on the relevance of purpose. And there is a very long relationship between the Harvard Business School and Mahindra, which started with Anand Mahindra being a student there and being on the Dean's Council. But more than that, we have a lot of engagement. So they know us very intimately over the last 15, 20 years. And I think that for them and for us, it was an opportunity to better understand how you take something which is potentially fuzzy, poetry, philosophy, and convert it into the nuts and bolts of decision making. What are the dilemmas? What are the trade offs? What are the choices? How do people who have to run to metrics, or many of them very short term, how do they build purpose, in fact, use purpose to get better metrics? So these were the kinds of issues that were sought to be surfaced in that case study. It was worked on over a 2-year period, roughly. And my role really was in the initial stages to help the professors who were writing the case study, along with, it was not just me, there were Anand Mahindra himself was involved, on why, why we took up this drive, what it meant to us. And then, of course, what and the how, and then the who and the when and the where, and the problems that were encountered, the dilemmas, so that it became something practical. Now, of course, I'm not for a moment suggesting that there are answers there. As I think it's been mentioned several times, there are no easy answers. It's a difficult world out there, full of conflict, full of people who are coming at any one subject with very different points of view. But to say that there is a corporation that has actually used purpose, who's actually looked at solving the problems that go beyond the boundaries of the firm and using those problems to create good business, just was a very, very exciting prospect. So this case study actually has come out on the 10th of April 2021. And for me, it is something which I hope will help us to review what we are doing and to make us better, and to actually do a lot of communication within the company. And I hope it will help Harvard and any other business school who is looking at the role of purpose, because I think it is absolutely central. And in fact, when there is a crisis, especially the COVID crisis, far from purpose and values going into the sidelines, actually they are center stage, whether we like it or not. All the decisions that are being taken with respect to cash, with respect to supply chain, how you deal with labor, do you let people off? Do you not let people off? Whose salaries do you cut? Are there sources of cash outside of labor? Is labor a short-term cost to be minimized, or is it really one of those rare appreciating assets, which, if invested in properly over time, can give you benefits that far outweigh the cost? There are very fundamental issues, and I think what the COVID-19 has done is to highlight the interconnectedness of things and to highlight how important philosophy or purpose or values are to hardcore decision making. We tend to think that there is something called business and there is something called purpose. Whereas the two just go together, whether you like it or not. You may not articulate it as such, but at the core of every business decision is a philosophy and a view of the world and a purpose. And and I certainly belong to the tribe that would like to think that purpose and good business and innovation need to go together. And the more case studies that we develop, the more we bring real life into the classrooms, so that the business school students till now have just automatically assumed that they have to pray at the altar of the shareholder. Is that the reality? Is that true? Have people challenged that? In practice, what does it mean? I think there are so many issues that are coming up, and I just hope that this Mahindra case study will be one of many, many cogs in the big, huge wheel. I see a big movement that is going on in the world And it would be good if Mahindra can contribute to creating a view of the world that does not necessarily see purpose and values and doing good as being very different from doing good business. And really what it is throwing up is, what is the purpose of business? So I think these are some deep questions that are being raised, no simple answers.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, it's when we speak um, with educators about these issues, you know, they often refer us to case studies, you know, as a central part of teaching. So it's really interesting. And as you suggested, it was published just a month and a half ago. So it's really interesting to see that case studies are coming in. Dorothée, I cannot see your video feed anymore, but I think you wanted to react to what Rajiv was saying. If you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you well. I don't know why my video has disappeared. I'm sorry about that. Rajiv, I wanted to congratulate you on this case study because I think it's incredibly powerful to have these examples. At the Geneva School of Economics and Management at my center, we've also started a case study series focused on companies that are trying to align profits and principles, as we say, in different industry contexts. We've put out a case study on Decathlon. We're working and soon finalizing one with ABN AMRO Bank. So in different industry sectors to understand how companies are figuring things out. They're not perfect, but they're pioneering innovation, business model innovations that I think are worth highlighting. And Another thing that I wanted to bring up is that I think for our field, it's really helpful if the business school itself has strong values. Rajiv, you mentioned the strong values of your company, but at the Geneva School for Economics and Management just a few years ago, they really defined 3 strong values, namely rigor, relevance, and responsibility. And the Geneva Center, of course, feeds and embodies these values. And that really helps us to make the case that our work needs to be core to business education because it fits those values. And business school accreditation organizations increasingly want to see that these are not just words in a mission statement, but that they're actually being put into practice. So that gives you another argument as an instructor to say, we can't just put out beautiful vision statements, but we also need to deliver on them. And one way to deliver on rigor, relevance, and responsibility is to bring in responsible business courses into the core, not on the sidelines, but as core teaching commitments. Thanks.
Thank you, Dorothée, for sharing this, and I absolutely support your message. I think it's true that business schools, at the end, are businesses as well in some form, and the more they are capable of being transparent about their purpose and their mission, the better, most probably. Before we move on to the last part of the discussion, I received a question for the audience that I wanted to ask to Dinah and Dorothée maybe quickly, and then I see Emily's raising her hand. Very quickly, someone is asking us, when you're working with your students on these issues, what are the most common questions concerning human rights that students bring up to you? What are most probably they ask questions when they come into the classroom, and the question also was whether there was maybe a difference between Europe and Asia. So quite quickly, and then Emily will take your comment. Dinah, Dorothée, what are the most common questions you get from students with respects to human rights?
If I may start, Charles, I think here in my classroom, I get also managers of local businesses, right? And I think the main questions that they pose to me is, look, I mean, it's wonderful to be responsible businesses, Dinah, but if our suppliers are not expecting it, the government's also not expecting it. I mean, really, why do we need to actually invest in these kinds of practices, which, I mean, needs us to really spend valuable resources, like we said, sometimes here in during COVID now, it's a matter of survival, and so those kinds of questions are very real questions from businesses, and that's why it's good to have a project like Responsible Supply Chains in Asia, where the bigger companies, the bigger buyers who actually come to the Philippines and procure the services and products of the Philippines would hopefully support these small businesses and how they can align with their principles around responsible business, because that is really really important, that kind of expectation. Of course, I mean, we can also say that it is important for them to have good practices around labor, because employees who are treated well will definitely be more productive. But at the same time, it's an employer's market, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot of jobs going around, and so it's hard for the employers to sometimes see that kind of incentive, right? And I think it's very important for a lot of the stakeholders to provide certain incentives, similar to what the suppliers are also trying to do with their buyers, with their small suppliers, right?
Thank you. And Dorothée, in your experience, would it be the same type of questions? Why should we invest in this, or do you get other questions from students?
No, similar. They have many, many questions. I think many questions are really focused around the how to do it, but also, as Dinah and Emily pointed out, how to sell it internally. So how can students be the intrapreneurs within their organizations to advance these topics? And this is particularly difficult in businesses where you cannot show an immediate so-called business case for engaging. So it doesn't pay off in the short term to improve labor standards, but investments even might be necessary. But then making the case that medium and long term, it just makes the more robust and more successful. I think that is what some students are struggling with in terms of how can I explain this to my superior? How can I convince them if my incentive is to show are based on key performance indicators that have a much shorter time horizon, 6 months, 12 months. And so that disconnect between short-term success and the longer-term vision we need for the implementation of human rights in business, I think that's something that business school students are struggling with, and I get a lot of questions about how to tackle this specific aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a student asking me once, if I see a human rights abuse in a company, should I take the risk maybe of denouncing it and risking my own position within the company? And I think that relates also a lot to the environment in which we live right now, which is sometimes, students arrive in the classroom reading news and watching how sometimes human rights defenders are treated, and and they're concerned about abuses, but at the same time they are looking at their own individual career, which most probably each and every one of us can understand, and finding how those dilemmas play out, and having the possibility also to discuss these dilemmas in the classroom is something really interesting. Emily and Rajiv, I saw you raise your hand. Emily, you wanted to react. Go ahead. You're on mute, Emily, please.
Sorry. It was before on the discussions about business schools as businesses and case studies. I just wanted to make a commendation for the Yale School of Management. My brother was actually from the class of 1990. I don't know, Rajiv, which year you graduated. Maybe you're a colleague of my brother's. But that they have a beautiful case study on Cadbury and child labor. That it makes a wonderful case study because there are so many other materials I've put together from when it's been bought up, because it really helps to draw out the contrast in management styles, because when Cadbury was bought up by Kraft, anyway, I won't get into it. But anyway, their case study was for free. And when I called them, I contacted them, I said, can I use this case study? And they said, oh, yes, it's a public good because these issues are so important. We made this case study available to everyone. It would be great if Harvard and other business schools that don't make their case studies free, and most business schools don't, and I appreciate that. Business school case studies, there's a lot of effort goes into developing them, but if they could make them free or at reduced price, not for necessarily students at Bocconi they can pay, but at other business schools, especially in developing countries. One reason I don't use Harvard case studies or anything else is not because of the Bocconi students, but remember, I'm also inviting professors from developing countries who are hopefully going to integrate those tools into their local curriculum. And I cannot use $200 case studies that their students just can't afford. So that would be my one pitch as a contribution to business and human rights that business schools can make, at least in the area of human rights issues, make their case studies free.
Thanks very much, Emily, for this suggestion. I think it's a very good way of putting purpose in practice. Also, when we talk about having a strong statement, that's a good way of showing it as well. Rajiv, I saw you raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, so I just wanted to react to what several of my esteemed panelists have been saying. I think that unless the leaders have, their own view about how important purpose and environment and other of the factors are that we've been talking about, I'm afraid it won't work. So, most business schools have to do a lot of executive education. And I think that that is the platform that business schools must use very aggressively. But to do that, they first have to be convinced themselves that, for this is an era where you have to have a relook, even if you assume that the success of a firm is critical. What is the time frame that you look at? And the word, you cannot, I think, assume that a person, a leader, only looks what happens inside the firm and doesn't, and can assume that the outside world will continue to sustain everything else that it has been doing till now. That's not going to happen. And climate change and COVID, for example, has brought that about so powerfully. So I think the leaders have to have a shift of mindset. Many leaders, some of them have it. And what is the role of business schools through leadership education or executive education in making that change? That's very important. The second one is, we talk about supply chain. Yes, of course, a lot of work has to be done, but the supply chain behavior is driven by the buyers. And I think Dinah mentioned that. It is so important for the buyers to also know what kind of behavior they are forcing on their supply chain. So really, you can't just point at the supply chain and say human rights issues is a problem of the supply chain. It starts with the attitude and the behavior of the buyers. So I think that is important, that we must always keep looking at what is it that I have to do. Yes, what is it that others have to do, but a lot of things start with myself, and you can't, of course, boil the ocean all at once, but we have to start somewhere. And I think, a good question to ask leaders is, if not you, who? And if not now, then when? When the planet is destroyed, when there is revolt and rebellion and bloodshed all over, is that when business leaders will wake up? Sorry to sound like Che Guevara, but I thought I'd just put my two bit.
Thank you, Rajiv. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We just have 7 minutes left, and I wanted to give all of you the opportunity for some concluding observations or recommendations, a little bit very concrete recommendation like Emily suggested, case studies on human rights accessible for all, or at least at reduced price. That those are great ideas and very concrete. I'd like you to focus maybe your concluding remarks on the way ahead. We've talked a lot about the situation that we went through as students ourselves, or in the past as teachers, what's happening right now, these interesting innovative initiatives that all of you are working on. What's next? What would be your concrete suggestions, requests, recommendations? Do we need to look at a common effort to develop some sort of standardized training material available for free or at reduced price so that we equip as many teachers as possible to be able to teach these issues? How do we make sure also that when Emily, you stop teaching at Bocconi, what you've started to do keeps on going. So how do we make sure that all of these initiatives don't just rely on the passion that all five of us share, but that they are transferable and sustainable? Emily, let's start with you. What would be your final recommendation?
Yeah, I would suggest to a good first start would be warehouse. I don't know about other people. I could never use someone else's materials. I'm just too pig-headed. I need to be and to really understand the logic of what I couldn't just pick up someone else's materials. But other people that can, they're welcome, and we can maybe workshop a set of materials that is sort of the good of all of them, without being too obnoxious. I'm pretty sure my materials are the strongest on accurately conveying international labor standards principles and how they relate to business, because that is my job. But ILO doesn't know much about remedy, for instance. What does an effective remedy in a private sector look like? I don't know. I can read stuff, but my guess is other people have. So maybe workshopping and taking the best of the various different perspectives, to have a sort of base of materials that doesn't look necessarily like a course, but here's half an hour or an hour on this, or this is an exercise on this point, and to create a little library, but especially of case studies, because as much as I put a lot of effort into trying to find case studies from a developing country perspective, the vast majority of case studies are very biased towards big buyers, not small buyers and not suppliers. So having a better balance of case studies from around the world would be extremely helpful for me. And I can offer, the ILO would be happy to workshop, if people can pay their own way, or if we try and get a grant from a government like the EU, because everything's so linked to trade, from DG Trade or something, to have a set of materials that we workshop together and make it cover people's travel costs. But that's my concrete suggestion. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Diana, I see you nodding your head. Do you have another suggestion as well?
I think those are wonderful suggestions, but I'd like to just bounce off what Rajiv had mentioned about, everything starts with you, with each of us individually. And so, like for me, what I have done in terms of, using the kind of training that I've gotten from ILO and using my center's platform to actually really try to reach out to companies so that they can incorporate these principles around responsibility, right? I mean, and really doing everything that we can do, as a consumer, as an, team leader for my employees, and as an employee myself. So we can do a lot of things, and hopefully we can start from there and become, like Rajiv said, a multiplier. Because for some of the companies that we have been working with that are really the leaders around incorporating a lot of these principles, what we try to also ask them is, are you cascading it down to your suppliers or to your industry peers, right? I mean, how can they actually become more like you? Because these are things that are really, really important. And as long as we don't have that kind of minimum expectation of what it is like to behave responsibly as a business, then there's always those few that will try to get around and not want to do it, right? And really, we need to have the power of numbers behind us in order to really drive this kind of change. So, but again, it starts with you as an individual.
Thank you, Naina. And Rajiv, you're representing the International Organization of Employers in this discussion, the voice of the employers of the business sector. What would be your recommendation to participate in reshaping and reboosting business education in the future?
Yeah, well, I would say that at the core is making out a business case for responsible business and human rights. And doing that through case studies, through lots of interactions with the industry, and then using the power of networks, of coalitions and partnerships to drive this. And not
Thank
try
you,
and do it
Rajiv.
on the
That's a good segue to Dorothée. Dorothée, the power of networks. Does that inspire you?
Yes, perfect segue. Thank you, Rajiv. I actually want to I have a wish for the audience, namely to join our network, the global network of business schools for human rights, and advance our work as a powerful collective. I'm also keen to follow up with Dinah and Emily to figure out how we can work together on pooling teaching resources, but also probably co-developing them, putting them at the same place. And the easier it is for instructors to pick up teaching materials, the more likely it is that they will use them. So if we have ready-made material in one place that can be easily accessed, as you said, Emily, and that fits into existing programs, then I think we have the best chance for uptake. And last, I also have a wish for Rajiv and other business leaders, for business school deans. It's incredibly powerful if they hear from business leaders that skills taught in business human rights classes are demanded in practice. So if you could speak up even louder with your peers that these are 21st century leadership skills that you want to be taught at business schools, it would really help all the business and human rights instructors at business schools to do their job.
Thank you very much, Dorote. And we're just on time. I know it's late in the Philippines, and I don't want to take any more time from Dinah. Some of us in Europe have skipped lunch to do this side event, so we're going to stick to the time. It was a great pleasure to have all four of you. I think your passion for these issues is really visible, and I do hope that those within the audience who are interested in these discussions, we can continue the discussion afterwards. Some of us are active on social media talking about these issues, and hopefully some of the ideas that you've come about, workshopping, networking, will come into effect in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this side event. I look forward to meeting our speakers in person sometime soon. And I hope also that our future students will enjoy their business school education and will make the best out of it. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you.